This interview was made possible in part by a grant from Arts DFW. Hi, I'm Amy Cardoso and welcome to Art This Week. On this week's episode, we visit the Amon Carter Museum of American Art, and our interviewer, Melynda Seaton, speaks with curator Maggie Adler about their exhibition, Sargent, Whistler, and Venetian Glass, American Artists and the Magic of Murano. Now for Art This Week.
Hi, we're at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art in Fort Worth to talk with Maggie Adler about the traveling Smithsonian exhibition, Sargent, Whistler, and Venetian Glass, American Artists and the Magic of Murano. Thanks for speaking with us today, Maggie.
My great pleasure.
So to kind of get us started off, can you just provide a brief kind of summary of the exhibition and maybe a little bit about the concept behind combining the Venetian glass in the same area as the artworks, the paintings and the drawings?
Absolutely. So around the time of Venice's incorporation into Italy as a nation, they had this great resurgence in the popularity and the craftsmanship of Venetian glass, particularly from the island of Murano, which was where the glass furnaces were. And these glass artisans were creating new and exciting replicas of ancient objects and objects from the Renaissance, which was encouraging a whole group of American artists to make Venice part of the grand tour of Europe. So American artists like Sargent, like Whistler, like Winslow Homer, William Merritt Chase were coming to Venice, and they were inspired by the sights that they saw in the Venetian glass factories, the bead stringers, the lace makers of Murano, and they were bringing these artworks back into American collections and American museums.
And so how exactly, since this is a traveling show from the Smithsonian, how did the Amon Carter become a hosting institution?
Yeah, we have a small network of American art curators who tell each other about the projects that they're working on. And so we were approached by Alex Mann, Crawford Alexander Mann, who was the curator who created this show at the Smithsonian. He's now the chief curator at the Telfair Museum. But he came to us and he said, seems like the Amon Carter would be a natural place, given our love of Sargent, Whistler, and all things American, to be a host for this exhibition that I'm conceiving. So we've known about the show for many years, and we're glad to have it come into reality. And for me, I'm seeing some of these works for the first time in person, whereas when you're the organizing curator of an exhibition, you've shopped around to figure out what you want to put in the show. Now I'm the adoptive parent of an exhibition that Alex has painstakingly put together over a number of years.
What makes the Venetian glass so unique or so important that drew these artists to the city or collectors to start collecting it in America?
I think it started out with just the fact that these are traditions handed down over generations. So the ability to integrate metallic elements, different colors, stripes, make these tiny little glass objects that there are portraits in the exhibition that are maybe a half an inch in diameter, made out of one slice of a cane of glass. So it's the intricacy with which they were creating it, but it was also really good marketing and promotion on the part of these 19th century Venetian glass firms. So they made sure that they were at the World's Fairs, that they had the patronage of Queen Victoria, that collectors would buy their works, bring them back to the United States and show them off in our founding museums and in their private collections. And they also had connections to people who would write articles for magazines about how you were supposed to decorate your home. So a Venetian goblet became a necessity for your mantle. If you were a certain middle-class person in 19th century United States, you had to aspire to a kind of decorating. And so even Tiffany's and Company, which is now Tiffany's here, carried Venetian glass and marketed it to the public in the United States. So that's part of why we associate Venice with Venetian glass, with this mastery of glass, is the fact that they were really good at tooting their own horn.
We know Sargent and Whistler were key artists who spent time in Venice. But are there any artists in the exhibitions we should know about that also spent time in Venice or focused on subjects related to the city and to glassmaking?
Sure. So we're sitting in front of two works by Sargent, but right near us is a painting by Robert Bloom, who was also a great American artist who spent time in Venice. He was mostly focused on the women of Murano, the lace makers. This exhibition could be called Sargent, Whistler, and Venetian Glass and Lace, also because the lace is really remarkable that we have on display. So Robert Bloom is one. There are actually many women represented in this exhibition. Maria Dewing is a printmaker who is associated with these magazine articles about how you decorate your home, so we have works by her, as well as just the leading names of American art in the 19th century, William Merritt Chase, and into the 20th century. So the illustrator Maxfield Parrish, when it came time to advertise new incandescent light bulbs, is even using scenes of Venetian light to advertise the luminosity of light bulbs. So there'll be something for everyone who has an interest in American art. So there's Winslow Homer here too, who never went to Venice, but he was able to see Venetian scenes when he visited the Chicago World's Fair because they had this fountain with Venetian gondolas that you could ride in at night.
I noticed when you look at a lot of the artworks that there's a lot of Venetian glass just featured in the compositions for those artists that didn't get to travel to Venice. One of my favorites is Louise Cox Mayflowers, where you have the little girl kind of staring at that dark blue vase. And so you kind of touched on this a little bit, but why do you think American artists and this kind of ubiquitous thing of where the Venetian glass is everywhere in America kind of happens at this time period?
I think they considered these Venetian glass artists their equals. I mean, it was really painting in glass. And so you wanted to bring back the studio. An American artist studio in the 19th century was a space of entertainment as well. As people would gather and they do theatrical productions, or they might reenact a painting, or it was a space to show off. And so you might have gathered around you these objects of beauty. And of course, as a painter, when you want to show your mastery of the medium of paint, to do something that's translucent or transparent is really complicated. So it's kind of an advertisement of your skill to show that you can render and paint what is almost impossible to even create in glass. So there's maybe a little bit of one-upsmanship or competition with the glass makers happening.
John Singer Sargent and Robert Frederick Bloom seem to focus on the women in the art-making process, and the image that we have behind us is one of those. So can you elaborate a little bit how each of these artists kind of approach that subject of focusing on the makers?
Yeah, I think what people had come to understand of Venice was really what they were seeing in books and in postcards and in historical paintings like Canaletto, which is a view of a canal in the bright light with, a bright blue sky, some pink sunlight hitting the white marble structures, and these are really just overall views of Venice. But what Sargent and Whistler and Bloom were interested in was the experience of Venice if you weren't necessarily a tourist. That you would go into these back alleys, you would go to the side entrances of churches, and you would find the real life Venetians who maybe when you have the tourist experience are in the areas of Venice that you don't encounter. So it's a way of saying this is the experience, the everyday experience of Venetians of Venice rather than the American abroad, just capturing the sights of San Marco or something like that. And I think Sargent in particular is giving a kind of artistic identity to the women who are the bead stringers. There's a mystery about them. They're dark paintings, but there's a kind of illumination on their arms or on their faces, the sites of their creativity. So he's giving, I think there's a real reverence for the glassmakers and for the women who are creating this lace and the beads as artisans as well.
There is such a variety of glass creations in the exhibit. What accounted for the many types of artworks and techniques, from like the hand-blown goblets to bead making to the figurative sculptures created in Venice during the late 19th century?
Yeah, what accounts for this revival of Venetian glass is initially the need to restore San Marco, or St. Mark's, the Cathedral of Venice. And so there was a demand for, at the start at least, mosaic tiles that could match the historical splendor of Venetian glass that had fallen out of favor. So in the 1500s, Venetian glass was all the rage. And by the 1700s, there was kind of a dark ages in Venice. And so as they're trying to restore San Marco and become part of Italy, there's a need for glass supply. So it starts with mosaics, and then it expands into historical objects, and the idea that we could build on, or the glassmakers could build on historical models and create as faithful a replica as possible of an ancient model. And then, because glassmakers are artists, they were never satisfied with just replicating models that already existed in the world. They had some time on their own each week or each day to experiment with designs all their own. And for those types of work, they're creating Art Nouveau, new creations. They're borrowing from Japanese ceramics, and they're creating kind of dragons that you would expect to see in Japanese artworks. So there's an experimentation that builds off of the historical models and the replication of historical models. And then, patrons had a say too in what was popular and what was marketable, and so that kind of expands the world of Venetian glassmaking. But it's really all based on a kind of prominence in the world of glass that was historical, forgotten, and brought back to life. I just think it's really fun to imagine trying to drink out of some of these goblets, and so I encourage visitors when they come to kind of put themselves in the shoes of a homeowner who acquired these objects. There's really only one cup, I think, that I would be able to drink out of without fearing of breakage. So it's kind of fun to imagine the idea of having these objects in your home and how they might have engaged with your daily life or your dinner parties.
Can you tell us a little bit about artists, like painters that experimented with glass as a medium, like Maurice Prandergast did in his mosaic Fiesta Grand Canal?
Yeah, it's a really remarkable work in the exhibition. Maurice Prandergast is really known as an American Impressionist painter, and so his paintings are dots of paint, as you would expect from an Impressionist. What many people don't know, and what I didn't know until this exhibition, is that he also experimented with mosaics. And so when you see this mosaic work that's blue and pink and it's created with these circular tiles, you have a sense of how his work in glass might have inspired his painting technique as well. So there's a kind of back and forth between media and a cross-pollination, I think, between glass and paint. And the same is true for Charles Carroll Coleman, who was a furniture maker who makes these elaborate frames for his paintings. But I think he must have been inspired by the decorative arts that he collected in his studio as part of the inspiration for his paintings.
I wanted to see, because it's not a show that you put together yourself, like you mentioned you didn't get to see them in person, are there any little special touches that you've added as the curator at the Amon Carter?
Yeah, we always put our own spin on the shows that come to us. So I'm not an expert in glassmaking, but we have local expertise in glassblowing. Seneca Studios in Fort Worth help the visitor visualize how a glass goblet comes into being. Because to me, it's just magic, but to them, it's a series of steps and functions that they understand really well. So we've added an interpretive component to the exhibition that includes a step-by-step process of how glass canes are made, which form the basis of beads and many other works in the exhibition, and then how a goblet comes into being, from the sand that is the raw material to the finished product. And so hopefully that gives visitors a notion of how complicated these glass works are and how intricate the process is of making them, just by seeing the kind of reduced representatives of their type.
We want to thank Maggie for speaking with us. For more information on the exhibition, go to cartermuseum.org. That's it for Art This Week. Thanks for watching. Find all of our videos and sign up for our newsletter at artthisweek.com. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter.